joined the Peace Corps, which is a volunteer organization. And the idea was, oh, I can empower people by helping them create their own money. That was the mantra kind of at the time. And so I attempted to do that in lots of different ways with lots of different groups, eventually forming a CBO, community-based organizations, and later a foundation. We went from different types of paper vouchers. We've always had some type of expiration rates on those that we can go into. That's like Demarage. We went into digital vouchers around 2015. We started using blockchain around 2018. We'll explain why. And up to today, we have quite a lot of network interaction between many different groups using similar systems. The big aha a few years ago was that once the groups were developing their own vouchers, which are basically claims against their production, generally denominated in shillings, so shillings of product, like a gift card. They were using these internally as well as externally, but the groups using them the best. And this was after a program with World Food Program where we had a good RCT, and Theodora was part of this. We were able to measure how much more productive in different ways, like farms built, houses built, and the groups that were practicing more of these traditions were extremely more successful than the groups who didn't. And that was the first time in 10 years of doing this that I had even really understood that that was a tradition. And so embarrassing to me in a way, but also enlightening. So we'll talk about that process, but some of the work we've done with the Red Cross, we've seen a lot of good impacts, and those seem to correlate almost directly with the usage within these systems. Mueria translated over into things like merry-go-rounds, where like they would cash roundup. The traditional version didn't use cash at all, so we'll get into that more. So I want to talk about those systems and just how I'm trying to understand them sort of more from a economic anthropology or an economics kind of point of view. A lot's written about these, but generally from the point of view of like a gift economies. It's very vague in terms of different forms of reciprocity in them. There's many forms of these within communities, but essentially there's a form of group commitment. 2 days worth of work over different periods and different seasons. And so I'm being a bit general here, but essentially if we can understand that here's 3 families, there's an assessment of their capacity of how much they'd like to give to the community. The basket in the middle represents an intangible commons. We can kind of think about this as balance of trade would be your assets minus liabilities. Essentially, they're sort of identifying their assets in a way. They're identifying what's valuable. In Swahili, you'd say rasilimali, which is like all their intangible assets and natural assets. There's a public offering. The public knows there's witnessing that there is commitment among the community for the next season, for the next harvest, let's say. So they're putting into this basket. Imagine this is a basket held in memory of the participants. There's nothing physical going on here. But there's some sort of form of commitment being put into this commons. So this is, I'm just trying to model it here. In a way, you can imagine that there's no trade that's happened yet. So you can imagine there's zero balance of trade yet. There's a lot of translation we're doing into frames like mutual credit, where you're looking at balance of trade quite often. So at this point, they haven't really traded anything, yet they do have a liability. They've made a promise that's being held by the community, right? The promise has been accepted by the community, but it hasn't been acted on yet. So their assets minus liabilities are zero at this point. This first family puts in some more of their commitments and pulls out the commitments releases them of their obligation because they come and help. So essentially the form of, in linguistics, the term mueria, and this is common across the early forms of this in France, the early forms of corvée. It was a call, an ask for a request of a group. So you call to the group, say, I want to call upon this commons, I have access to do so, and I'm giving my commitment as well as part of that. And that's done in many different ways, some hard and some soft, right? Like being a member of the community can be considered sort of reciprocity around this. So this person, this family on the left here is putting in their commitment, they're receiving help from the others, and these guys have less commitment in the group. So these guys have a positive balance of trade, they have got credit within the community, right? And these guys have a debt, right, within the community. And they build a hut. Okay, so this is, let's say this is a granary for the next season. Okay. And the second family does the same thing, they build their huts, right? The third family does the same thing. Sorry for the spaghetti diagrams here, but essentially they all come back to balance. They're back to balance of trade, right? They've built physical assets, they've built social assets, there's more trust in the community, there's skills being shared, all the families are involved, there's a sense of purpose in the community, there's political voice that they're able to organize these and actually, bring people in and have ready work for them to do. And generally they would also, this was part of management cycles around sacred forests. So all the tribes that we were looking at in the video, they form around what's called the kaya. The kaya is it's similar to the term oikos in Greek, which is basically the home. It's used across all Bantu languages as home, but home also can mean society. It also includes the sacred forest, includes all parts of the society out into the whole clan structures. This is you can see Audini in the back there. This is a group in Uganda. It was called the Women's Leadership Circle, and this is a super group where each one of these women has another 15 women that they do this practice with. And we were working with this super, they had built that house just recently behind there using these practices. And we were just, back of the envelope trying to sort of calculate, well, how much value would that be if you were to measure this one group, over years? And we got into a significant fraction of the GDP of the entire country just by lowballing the argument within this one region of how much value is actually being generated just in labor. And that's not talking about production value of their farms, their houses, and everything like that. So there's a huge amount of value there that's really just not being seen in any way by nation states and whatnot. This is just thinking about these things as a form of like social infrastructure, where what are these connections, these social connections between people, and these kind of commons infrastructure. This is just a roadmap of pre-colonial Kenya in one area, and I just thought it was interesting just thinking about how these systems were at some points. There's a large history of these coming and going due to we'll get into colonization and whatnot, and understanding that there was this very living social infrastructure, very much like you might imagine. I imagine like mycorrhizal fungi and natural ecosystems have a very interconnected kind of pooling systems for resource sharing. So in terms of just really trying to understand from this perspective, a lot of, I've gone a lot into Ostrom, trying to understand the value systems that these types of agreements would live among, and then what were the instruments of those agreements? How would they keep track of things? Were there forms of ledgers? What were the rules, within those systems? I'm not going to go super into it. I've had a lot of fun reading the work of Mark Burgess on promise theory, and he's got a lot of, he comes from a computer science background and talking about these agents within network spaces and computers, like your RAM versus your hard drive versus your CPUs and different software. How do they actually build reliable, trusted systems? So he has this lot of theories around trust that I've enjoyed, and it comes back to this idea that there's this form of intention, what he'll call a promise or a commitment, and really keying in on what that is, and really understanding it from the communities we work in. What is that form of commitment, and then how are those commitments accepted in group, not just individually, not just transactionally or exchanged, but how are commitments within a community actually held together? And then how does fulfillment work now? How do you build trust within those systems? We've over the years, we've always used the term voucher when we printed our bills and everything, but originally I would have talked about community currency. That's the vernacular that I used. And we've kind of found over the years that as soon as you mention money or currency, it keys people into a framework. And we'll talk, I have a slide about that framework, but just trying to now understand what's the vernacular or the schema for a commitment. And there could be many, and this is sort of a minimal kind of thinking about these things in different ways. Like there's some value, right? So like an amount, usually in some unit of account, could be in time, it could be in national currency, of some service, right? That it's redeemed as payment for. So this commitment, if you accept it, it can be redeemed for what was promised, right? You're keeping your word. In other words, it's like logos. You know? There's some authentication. You know who is involved in this, whether they're two named parties or it's the group and that family. Generally, there's some form of expiration. These things don't last forever, and that's kind of, we don't use the word demurrage so much anymore. We just talk about decay rates or expiration rates. Generally, so we have expiring vouchers that go back to the issuer over time. And then, depending on the situation, it can be a bearer instrument, right? So this diagram here, we're just playing around with visual language and trying to also understand the correlation between, or the connection between credit space. When we're looking like at a mutual credit, you have this creation of imbalance, right? So you have a commitment, it's accepted in some way. Once that's done, there's this, it's like a anti-particle creation. There's this creation of tension, right? And there's this seeking of settlement through fulfillment. So often in like mutual credit space, we're very, very focused on plus and minus, let's say plus and minus since it's zero. And we sometimes in mutual credit zones, or even in my work, we haven't really specified what the commitment was. Is there a promise behind this thing? And even if it's a loose promise, let's identify it somehow. Let's be keen to articulate what is the intention. Is there any clarity on the intention? And in some cases, when I did this early on, it wasn't clear what that intention was. Like airdropped tokens on people. What's the intention there? Or you want them to trade with it, but whose promise is that? Is that someone's commitment? And so I think we've, as an organization, really had to understand that if it's us making a commitment as an organization, or we're helping people make their own commitments as communities. And so we've gone through a lot of hard cycles around understanding that stuff. A lot can also happen in the acceptance space. You can look at that in terms of pooling, like can a group hold it? Where does the credit and debt go within a group? So commitment pooling has been a term that I've kind of been coining recently to describe the sort of protocol space, trying to basically break down what some of the mechanics within these traditional practices. And I would call these practices something like proto-social. Like they seem to be almost pre-lingual evolved practices in a lot of cases. They seem to be everywhere as well. Europe, you can find them in almost any indigenous community, some version of that. So fundamentally, you've got something that is formalizing some type of commitment. You are expressing a commitment, in this case, for apples, bread, and carrots, for instance. So there's some sense of curation. You're curating a space, right? None of these things are currencies. We wouldn't talk about them like that. I don't think of them as money. We'll kind of get into that as well. You're also establishing now relative value. So if someone brings in their apples into the community, how many carrots can they get? In other words, what you're doing is giving them what Keynes might have called drawing rights, right? So these commitments have drawing rights from the commons. So there's a commons there. We say, okay, there's resources there. These are intangible resources, but they're commitments for resources. I have, by being named within this community, I'm in the group, and you heard in the video that they do exclude. You can be kicked out of the group as well. You have reciprocal draw. I can call upon the community, and that's the word, mueria, to call upon the community for assistance, and they will also give you a max capacity of how much you can do that, right? So how much of my commitments can actually go in the community compared to everyone else, right? So you sort of balance these pools that way. And then relative value essentially ends up being an exchange rate. So if I take one apple is worth one bread in this case, or at least could be $1 of bread or €1 of bread. The exchange rate between them would be the value of one divided by the other. And so there's many ways to do pricing, but this is how we've established it. We used to, when we were very first into blockchain, we used automated pricing mechanisms, where based on the supply, it would just automatically change. And it made no sense to anybody. It was like, why is the value changing just because of this? Like, we believe apples and bread are equal in this group. Like, why should So that's the whole bonding curve land, and it doesn't necessarily make sense at this level. Um, so this has been kind of a solution. We call this like a price index or a price vector, and there's an implicit unit of account, which would be sort of like your unit vector in that direction, right? So there's nothing here specifying unit of account. It's really the community to establish or formalize the relative values of the things that are going in the pool. So this is me, going from exchange space into pooling space. And so this has been a big mind shift in a way for me. Like we don't this. Matthew would always tell me that this is more of in the realm of like finance, right? Like production financing, for instance, right? Where you're getting something, and you're going to do something in return and give it back. Like it's a very there exchange is in there, but it's definitely a very different thing. So I'm just going to briefly talk about how we work with communities in Kenya. This is one of the areas that we work with in Kwale. Um, and I like this slide. I won't labor on about it, but the idea that what people call money there, and in common vernacular, has a very clear lineage. It's essentially a tradition. We can place the word money back to Moneta, which was the Juno Moneta was the goddess of money, same as Hera in Greek, and she was in charge of safeguarding the wealth. Right, they would have these temples. You would pay a tax to the temple, right? And that taxation system, you could think of it as a tradition, and thinking about these things as traditions is changed my mindset a little bit. If you imagine that money is actually a word for a traditional practice, right? Then maybe we don't want to co-opt it as much as we're using it now. We wouldn't use the word mueria for that. That's a particular tribe to talk about all economic space, right? Within that, and we often do that in this room, in this space. We put everything under money somehow, but money has, even the word has particular tradition. So it led directly into economic imperialism with fiat dominance, open markets, tax collection, cultural suppression, export focused decision. I mean, we can, that's the economic imperialism that led into nation states doing the same thing. With the fall of the Roman Empire, the feudal system picked it up as well. That led into the colonial system. So there's really a fairly direct, sniffable lineage, right? Anyone you talk to generally will say money is the thing you pay taxes for. Right. It's quite clear to the world, except it's not so clear to academics. And I think it's actually in some ways like there's this sense of there's a cultural appropriation of the word money going on, because there is a culture there of money. Right? Literally, it goes back, and yes, it's been redefined, and maybe that's okay to do. But it's kind of nice to reappropriate in some sense. And so now looking at what are proto-social traditions, how do we call these things? And I've been using the term commitment pooling for some of the practices or protocols within them. So to me, it's still a fairly uncharted space somehow, and I'm sure it's charted, and I just don't know enough about it. But I'm working hard to educate myself. Um, this was that history I was just mentioning of what coins minted into the Temple of Juno. This is what the term money came from. We have the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the feudal system, the term money being used to impose taxation for the feudal system. Then we have the colonial powers imposing taxation on their colonies, right? Then we have nation states doing exactly the same thing, and now we have digital versions of the same thing, right? So there's some. I think we can argue there's a fairly clear lineage for the tradition of money. Right. We might not know what money is, and it's hard to define. Everyone will disagree, but there seems to be a lineage. There seems to be a tradition there. I think we can safely argue that. This is just a chart to talk about sort of endogenous in yellow and sort of exogenous. So who's issuing commitments in the community? What sort of is the medium of exchange of it? Is it exogenous or endogenous, like local here, or exogenous? And what's the unit of account as well? And so we went from fully endogenous systems into fully exogenous systems, right? And you can kind of see that these two traditions intersected, right? There's this tradition of totally exogenous money as a taxation and control mechanism coming in and really ripping apart these local structures. And so something I think about, I've put sort of what we're working on here, this commitment pooling and asset vouchers, as sort of trying to find interoperability between, right, pooling together these local commitments of individuals and groups. Mostly what we do in communities today is we don't introduce currencies or even the technology so much. We learned a technique in Uganda called the visionary approach to community action planning. And it's a technique of doing visionary work. One of the first steps is doing asset mapping. And we break assets into a few different categories within the communities of social, human, spiritual, governance, natural, infrastructure, and economic. We do a lot of different kinds of mapping exercises, and we work with the communities to come up with their own surveys around these, which is really fun. A lot of games, and then we work on common vision. So really, often actually the vision exercise will come first. So they'll get into pairs, they'll draw, they'll come up with a family vision. They'll merge that with their neighbors. They merge that, what's in common across many groups, and so each family and each group has a vision, usually drawn out. What do they want their land to look like in the next year? Their farm, their house, all that stuff, and then they have their asset map over here. So the idea is there's a tension going on here. There's a structural tension between where they are now and where they'd like to be. And the idea is to release that tension. What is the way, how do we actually release that structural tension to reach your vision? And those action steps that they kind of come up with, those key back now into those traditional practices. So we say, if you have all these assets, there's some abundance here. How would you organize? How would you coordinate those resources in a fair way? And slash, how did you do it as children, or how did your parents do it? Right, because that's what's lucky about Kenya is there's still a lot of living memory. I mean, there's still living memory in Normandy. I was just up there of a lot of these systems as well. So I feel like we're in a very, like, if there was an endangered species on the planet, it essentially is this social infrastructure that's been around. And I think it's basically like looking at any ecosystem that's in danger. There's this endangered social infrastructure, and so they go back to that, say, oh, that's the way we used to do it. And so then we say, okay, great. What are sort of the tools that we can provide, or is there any way we can help you do that? What would it look like today to do that? And that's when we get into using a digital system, doing record keeping around that. This is an example path. This could be a community group or a business or an individual creating a claim, a voucher, redeemable for their own services, can enter circulation directly into markets, supporting people into the rotational labor groups. It can be settled through expiration, so that would be like your demurrage coming back again, or it can be settled through redemption. So the term, again, voucher or like gift cards, like we're trying to make it as clear as possible that this is not a currency. It's not, if someone says, how do I get other people to accept this thing? It's actually, that's a key to the it's kind of like a wrong question signal to me. It's basically saying, well, do you have some services you offer? And would anyone pre-order those? Like, do you sell bus tickets, right? The bus company doesn't say, how do I get everyone to accept bus tickets? No, it's a very different question, right? You start with guarantee, you start with service. And so, the money frame, again, sort of is already this sort of like, they know what money is already. And so once you push it into that frame, they're like, oh, whoa, national currency. And it sort of creates these expectations that aren't really healthy. Still 90-something% of our users are on feature phones. They use SMS and USSD. They don't need internet at all. We have a server sitting at the telecom. So they can set up an account. They set up a PIN here. Behind the scenes of this, it actually creates for them a blockchain account. And so that we are not the database this all lives on. So this was, we went to court when we first did this stuff in jail. And we wanted to make sure that we are not, if we get taken out, the system can keep living on. And so the blockchain has been a really cool way to do that. And we are part of the blockchain. So we actually also get paid to offer that service globally. So this has been a way for us to get off of grants. We don't have grants anymore. I mean, we're wonderful if they come, but we don't need them for our base operations. So that's been a huge thing. I'll explain it more later. But essentially, this is a little dynamic menu. It can pop up on any phone. You don't need internet. You can select any vouchers that you have. These would be commitments that of yourself or others that you have. You can choose which one you want to use. You can send it to other people. Both parties get an SMS. It's very simple. No features. This is a fun diagram here. This is just an active network diagram of the last month across all the groups. And there's a few of these that are international, but most of this is in Kenya. Each color there is a different voucher. And most of those are group vouchers, or some of them are individual and business vouchers as well. And you can see, for instance, like how these groups here, these are all groups in refugee camps. So we have a 5-year program with Red Cross all across a bunch of refugee camps. These are groups creating a shared commitment. So this would be like a cooperative making a gift card, if you will. They trade it internally, and then they also exchange it amongst each other. So there's a lot of really juicy information there around like kind of understanding, and even for us, a lot of our learnings have been looking at these and trying to understand what's effective and what's not, working with researchers to come in and help us figure that out as well. I just want to, blockchains are an environment to us. It's a virtual environment. It includes memory, right? You can keep track of things. There's an execution layer. So if I create an agreement, I can execute that agreement. I can lower my balance, increase his, and it's provable that's there. There's authentication, so you know who is there. Everyone has a little key to get in, and you can build agreements in there. So to me, it's a virtual environment space that you can do a lot in. And yes, a lot of people have done really crappy things in it, right? And so we generalize crypto a lot and blockchain, and I think it's actually it's this it sounds juvenile to me when I hear it from this group, because it's not actually, it's like saying anyone who's using an IBM computer is a bullshit, or something like this. And it's just like, well, okay, there's so many projects now going on in that virtual environment, right? And many different virtual environments like distributed ledgers. So it's resilient. It's very hard to shut us down. It's this one's very. We work with Celo. It's super energy resilient, efficient. It's only a few hundred servers. It doesn't need to envelop the whole world. There can be many of these different ledger systems. You can make your own. It's accountable. It's transparent. There's the transparency on it. We don't put any personal information there. It's really just a ledger system for us. So we're not putting any private information or anything like that. There's a lot of interoperability because you're on a shared protocols and ledger systems. These things can easily interact with each other. There's no lock-ins. You can build your own interfaces to it, right? So it's basically a back-end database system. You can build all kinds of front-end interfaces, and you don't have to get locked into those, right? So we have an interface with our website. It's open source. You can copy it. There's libraries. You can use it in so many different ways, and that will become easier and easier until it's as simple as anyone using a SQL database. You have a very simple library, and interoperability between these systems like the mutual credit commons protocol can potentially connect these things together as well. So there's a lot of work to connect different blockchains and ledgers also together. Yeah, I mean, anyone can create accounts at any time. We work with a lot of refugees who do not want, they might want to have 5 accounts, right? They don't want to be identified by the state, for instance. So there's the ability to not be identified or have multiple accounts. And it is paying all of our services at this point just by offering the service. So we run 5 servers. By running those 5 servers, people pay in a voucher to access the ledger, okay? In Kenya, we subsidize that completely. No one has to pay. We guarantee that as well. And that was the only way we moved blockchains about 4 times. And the only way we would be able to use blockchain in our kind of ethics was that we could make sure that we weren't going to be priced out of using that blockchain. And so we had to be the infrastructure, right? And so this, and this is moving into more like peer-to-peer systems and all kinds of stuff. So amazing for us that after 13 years, we're completely financially sustainable. We can pay all of our developers and all of our team forever at this point. Right? That's huge. I'm still pinching myself, but yeah. I'll just skim through this. Just to think about these as layers, right? So you have essentially the blockchain is essentially a consensus layer, right? So in the media system, if you have a dispute, you would go to a consensus layer. That would probably be the local elders. But there could be a smaller consensus layer that is the group itself or just your neighbors, right? So going to a group that's going to provide consensus on something is, I think it's always going to be important. And even if we get to fully peer-to-peer systems where there's no central blockchain at all, you're still going to end up with some sort of a pooling and peering of governance and responsibilities, and then you have interfaces into these things, and you can have many of these layers. This is just we're working in Mississippi now, well, also in different places in Europe, and we're trying to translate this. You know, what does that mean? And business gift cards, right, are pretty normal. Like people know what they are. Like it's a bus ticket is fairly normal. So we're never trying to explain to people create a currency or anything. We're just saying, how would you express your value? It doesn't have to be as a gift card exactly either, but what does that schema look like? What does it look for you to do that? This is a picture of Office Max in the US, right? So curations of commitments are things, right? They're things in our real world that we can sort of identify. There's all kinds of different examples of this type of stuff existing, but there are no pools, are very rare to find that you can exchange one of these for another, right? And so that's the sort of layer that we're trying to bring in with this kind of commitment pooling concepts is like where's the I think of it as like a yin instrument. It's a space, right? Instead of a medium of exchange, you have a space of exchange, right? The medium is the container, right? And what's in that container are value signals essentially, right? These are all identifying value, right? They're all commitments of some sort with an intention. So we've got this website now. By the end of the year, it'll be a mobile app. It'll be much easier to use as an app. Right now, you have to connect this to like a blockchain wallet to use. So unless you're a blockchain person, it's a little bit irritating. Um, but we're getting there. And so, yeah, one, express your value. We go to business and say, just make a gift card. It's free, totally free service. It's super easy to use. If you can do blockchain, eventually it'll be a bit better. Uh-oh, I run out of battery here. You can curate those into pools. So an individual or a group can say, these are the assets I value. We're going to create an exchange, a connection between them. You can practice Mueri in that. You can also do forms of production financing. I want to express this is the kind of the Red Cross version of this is that they're putting money into these pools first, right? This would be stable coins, and telling different service providers and consultants around refugee camps that they have drawing rights as long as they put in their services. The Red Cross will then take those services and give them to IDPs and refugees around the area, right? So, and what it leaves behind after Red Cross leaves is that this basket still exists and they can still keep trading, and that's what they're doing. So seeding those networks, right? Really composting your dollars into utility. It's kind of a nice analogy. We work a lot with regenerative agroforestry projects, and this is sort of another general kind of way to think about this. You could talk about solar projects. We work a bit with Chris Cook and Island Power. If you have networks of people offering services together, pooling those, like I just mentioned, into essentially like a rotating fund, allowing people to buy into those, hold those vouchers, and use them for products in the future. And those products could be offsets, it could be digital products, and we're working with coconut oil producers, so you get coconut oil, right? The vouchers go back into circulation. So it's a in this case it's just a simple production financing system with a collective, and it leaves behind uh, um, that container, and those containers can connect to each other. So the pools end up being forming networks. This is just I won't go into it briefly, but we work with a lot of what's called syntropic agroforestry that comes from Ernst Gulch in Brazil, and really it's an indigenous system of food forests. And this has been sort of our primary thing. Like if there's one thing that we really are working with a lot of these groups on their muerias, their traditional practices, it's food security. And there's a lot of really beautiful techniques that have been kind of streamlined out of the permaculture movement into just really focusing on food. But then in general, we're also working with OD and the Friends of Ecosystem Restoration Movement on larger landscape restoration projects, like doing water catchment and things like that as well. Briefly on the humanitarian sector, we work with a lot of them. They're seeing this as a way for them to basically create or support some social infrastructure and walk away. And the walk away bit's really important because most people hate it when Red Cross walks away because they're essentially like heroin dealers, right? They go in there and start dishing out money to everyone, and it's not done well, and then they stop. And it's just like, oh, and then next crisis in 10 years, and then do it again and again and again. And it's not really creating infrastructure.
Your battery's low, bro.
I know. I think I'll manage. So this actually the ability to have money in those pools in some of these cases has been the value signal that brings people into those networks. And then the money's gone and they keep doing it. The money might come back in a future season. So we're still, we're still in the intestine of this Roman traditional practice. We're still in there. And I see, money is sort of the poo that's pushing us along somehow, and we need to survive getting out of it. I'll stop there. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much. It was exactly how I dreamt.